It's Dr. Gianna Reams, and here we go. We're going to take our dive into the sources. We're going to start with the big five. That is our five narrative histories about Alexander, our surviving ones. There are quite a few that are missing. There may have been nobody in antiquity about whom more was written than Alexander. That's why we have five left. That's a large number for the ancient world, even though it might seem like a small number here. I'm going to go through them with you in order, that is, from the earliest on. And you'll begin to see immediately some of our problem. Our first problem is the dates, okay, for these guys. Our first one is Diodorus Siculus. This is a relatively new translation by Robin Waterfield, and I'll be showing you some books if you would like to have a copy of these. These are reliable translations, good ones that you can go pick up. And so this is a good one, and it gets over some of the issues that are in the earlier Loeb translations. Diodorus is writing in Greek, and he is writing, we think, somewhere around 60 to 30 BCE. In other words, in the middle era of the 1st century BCE. If you're thinking about where and when he is living in the larger scale of things, this is the collapse of the Roman Republic. Okay, so by this point, Sicily, where he is from, had been under Roman rule for a long time, relatively, and the Roman Republic was crumbling and was turning into what would become the Roman Empire. So the Battle of Actium, the big battle, is 31 BCE. And by 29, Octavian Augustus was creating the empire, the Principiate. So Diodorus is writing in that period. Why do we want to know that? Because it shades the interest of our historians. So Diodorus, our earliest source, is writing 300 years after Alexander. When did Alexander live? 356 to 323 BCE. Okay. Once more, this has a lot to do with some of our problems. So Diodorus is one of a group of writers often referred to as the Vulgate. Thanks to Tarn and W.W. Tarn and some others, those terms have been used. You have the Vulgate, which is Diodorus, Curtius, and Justin. And then you have Arrian, and Arrian, according to Tarn, is a reliable, good historian, and Plutarch. Plutarch's kind of in his own category. No. Okay. The Vulgate, however, are connected because all three of them, or their sources in the case of Justin, are utilizing Clitarchus. Clitarchus was, I guess, he was the popular history of Alexander in his time period. Maybe not always the most reliable, but it was the one most people were familiar with. It was the one most widely available. That is not the only source all of these guys are using, right? And particularly we know Curtius is using other sources, and Diodorus is quite probably using other sources as well. Trying to get at Diodorus' sources is a problem that a lot of historians have spilt some ink on. And I pointed out this one in particular because it covers books 16 to 20. Diodorus is writing world history. That means he goes way before Alexander and talks about this or that event, and not just in Greece or in Sicily, but all over. And he dates things by Roman consuls, he dates things by the Greek Olympics. So he's trying to give you a look at what's happening in the eastern and middle Mediterranean Sea. This is happening here, this is happening here, this is happening here. So he's got 40 books. We don't have all of these. And in fact, even of these that cover Philip is book 16, Alexander's book 17. 18 to 20 are the successors, and 18 to 20 are very fragmented. We're still missing things in book 17 and book 16 as well. There are some break points, especially in Bactria and stuff. We don't have some things in Diodorus. I wish we did have. We have the outline at the beginning of the book of what it is, and this stuff is missing, but that means because he's writing world history, he's not writing in as much detail. So Diodorus, in addition to being our earliest historian, is also our third longest. The two longest are Arrian and Curtius. But Diodorus is book 17 is kind of unusual in that all these others are kind of collections of various things happening in other places. Book 17 is about Alexander, and kind of just Alexander, which is an unusual approach for Diodorus. He doesn't do that a lot in the rest of his histories. But because of that tendency to collapse things, to simplify things, sometimes they get abbreviated to a point where we're not really sure what's going on, as with the Battle of Chaeronea. But he will occasionally preserve some important stuff. Diodorus has the one outlier version of the Battle of Granicus. The others all, including Arrian, follow another story, which is one you will usually see on documentaries or drama because it is a more dramatic version. Diodorus has the calmer version, and I would present to you probably the correct one. Okay. But because of all of that, again, the details in Diodorus can sometimes be, I don't want to say slippery, that's not really it. They're not at the depth that we would perhaps wish for. But he's not by any means a bad historian of Alexander, and I think sometimes gets unfairly dissed. So our next is another member of the Vulgate, but this time writing in Latin. This is Quintus Curtius Rufus, usually just called Curtius. All he writes about is Alexander. This is the only thing we know of that he wrote. Okay? And we don't know who he is. He's a little bit of a mystery. There's been some speculation as to who this man might be. But this creates a problem for dating him. We have to look internally. So when you're trying to date something, you can maybe date them externally because you know who this guy is or such. Or if you don't, you have to look within the text. So you're looking for comments in the text that will help us pinpoint when things that had to have happened because he references them by the time he was writing. So that kind of helps us pinpoint things. So there are really two possible dates for Curtius, the earlier dates and later dates. So the earlier dates want to put him either in the reign of Claudius or Vespasian. So that means one's about 41, Vespasian, much, not much, but a little bit later. So from the second half, let's say, of the first century CE. Okay, so Diodorus is in the first century BCE as the Republic is coming down. Curtius is writing in the imperial period, so he's our first imperial author, and he's in the latter half of the first century CE. So that's the earlier date. That's the one I personally favor. There have also been suggestions for the second century, early mid second century BCE. I'm sorry, CE. I'm not as keen on that date. I don't think he's that late. But Curtius, because he's an imperial writer, has a very Roman interest. Not only is he writing in Latin, he's thinking about Alexander through the lens of Roman emperors. Curtius has a very kind of anti-Oriental view. He wants to present Alexander, especially early Alexander, as the good guy. He's very moral. He's very ethical. By the end of his career, however, he has been corrupted by Oriental ways and Persianizing and such, and that corrupts him. So that's kind of the story of Curtius. In terms of Curtius, the reason now why he's shorter than Arrian is because we're missing chunks. Books 1 and 2 aren't there, so we don't really get Curtius as we have him starts more or less before the Battle of Issus. We're missing Granicus. We're missing Alexander's early career. They're not there. They're not in Curtius. We're also missing a huge chunk of Book 10 as well. So it takes up just after, basically, Hephaestion has died until Alexander's death. But we're missing all of this stuff before it. So this is unfortunate, just as we've got a big chunk missing, not as big in Diodorus. We've got major chunks missing in Curtius, unfortunately. But both Diodorus and Curtius, utilizing Clitarchus, have some similar stories and the kind of the order of things that pop up in these two that we don't necessarily find in Arrian or Plutarch sometimes. So that we can kind of look at that. But they have other things. Again, they're particularly Curtius is using other sources. There's material in there, some material in India that is not found in Diodorus. Also, Curtius uses a Macedonian source. We don't know who this is. Maybe Marcius. That's a good bet. Where he talks about Macedonian custom, and he says it that way, and the others don't do that. And so that's really interesting. So Curtius has some real value, I think, as a source in looking at this. Also, there's a lot more about Darius and what's happening on the Persian side of things in Curtius. Can we trust it? I don't know. There's been theories about where these sources come from, including a so-called mercenary source, which may or may not actually exist. But there are themes in Curtius that we don't find in the other histories. So he's definitely an interesting read, but just be very, very careful because there's a real moral tone in this. And Asians are bad, okay, according to Curtius. That then brings me to Plutarch. And Plutarch is another Greek writer. Plutarch is working, he lived from about 46 to the early 120s CE. And he wrote a lot. We have a ton of material from Plutarch. One group of it that gets lobbed under a general heading called the Moralia, and I'll talk more about that in another video. But the Lives is the one we're going to address here, the life of Alexander. It is our next to shortest history of Alexander, and it is a biography. In fact, Plutarch is sometimes credited as the inventor of biography. That might be stretching it a bit, but he says, and in fact, at the beginning of the Alexander, he gives an explanation of what he's doing. And he says, I am writing lives or biographies. I'm focusing on a little word said or an event that tells more about the person than the big battles. So I am deliberately not talking about the big battles. And so if Plutarch were all we had about Alexander, there are a lot of things we would not know about the people, especially around him and his battles as well. Plutarch lies. I think that's maybe my main thing. The more time I spend with Plutarch, the more aware of that I am. Plutarch does like his anecdotes, and as I said in that earlier video on tips, you have to be so careful of anecdotes, especially folks like Plutarch change players, and they utilize them. So when you're reading Plutarch, you always want to pay attention to the context. He takes things out of order and tells them together because he's trying to make a point. So please, please, please do not take apart his anecdotes. Don't just focus on this one event. Look at how it is placed. What is around it? What anecdotes follow it? What anecdotes might precede it? What is he telling you about these things? Because it says so much about how Plutarch wants you to think about Alexander. So again, that's Plutarch. Plutarch is also the first author that is solidly in a group we call the Second Sophistic. Curtius is not a Greek writer, but he's in kind of just a precursor time-wise. So Plutarch, and there are others. Arrian is another of the ones we're going to talk about, but we've got several in these, Lucian and such. Who are the Second Sophistic? The Second Sophistic were kind of deliberately archaizing authors who reach back into the glorious Greek past in form, sometimes even in the Greek employed. They have been living now under the Roman Empire for, a couple hundred years in some cases. What do we have to cling to? Greek culture, okay? Greek education. So for Plutarch, one of his themes, not unlike Curtius, is Alexander comes from this barbarian northern kingdom, Macedonia, kind of symbolized by mommy snakes, Olympias, and he gets good Greek paideia, good Greek education from whom? Aristotle, and that Greekifies him. He goes to Asia, he is a philosopher in armor, and then he meets Asian Oriental corruption and then descends again. So you have this kind of arc in Plutarch of Alexander's, I don't want to say rise, but maybe freedom from his barbarian background, and then how he becomes again barbarized by the Persianizing in the Persian court. That's a pretty second sophistic sort of thought. Okay, that we can claim to our culture. This is the thing that we still have. We're no longer independent, but we have that. Okay, Arrian is also a member of the second sophistic, even though Plutarch's much more to his own mind as a philosopher, a rhetorician, a writer. Arrian's a historian. That's kind of how he thinks about himself. This is the landmark Arrian, the Campaigns of Alexander. I really like this translation by Pamela Mensch. Some of the commentary I'm not as keen on. I disagree with parts of it. But why this one might be useful, and ignore all of my little notes to myself. This is how historians work. Each of these colors means something to me. But it has pictures in it, so sometimes you can see landscape, what something might have looked like, and then it has the all-important maps, which is what's so useful. So here is maps and landscape. Okay, so as you're reading through, it can be really handy. Arrian is our military guy. That's why a lot of times he can be deceptively good. Okay, and I say that on purpose. If you were looking at military, Arrian is, I'm going to trust Arrian first. Except, as I said with Diodorus, I think Diodorus got Granicus right, and Arrian follows a different version that I think is not right. But be that as it may, most of the time, Arrian is a more solid source. Arrian desperately wants to be Alexander's Homer. He doesn't even mince words about it. In his original, and he has what we call two prefaces. The first one tells you what sources, rarely he does actually tell you his sources, that he tends to preface. And he says, here's my methodology, and this is why I called him a historian. He tells us how he works. And he says, where I have found things that are in both Ptolemy and Aristobulus, which are his two main sources, that were alive during Alexander's reign. Aristobulus was along with Alexander, kind of the support personnel. Ptolemy, of course, is Ptolemy of Egypt. Ptolemy Lagos, the eventual Ptolemy Soter, or the first Ptolemy. And he says, where those two agree, I'm going to take it as fact. Where they disagree, I'm going to tell you what both of them say. And then if something doesn't appear in either of them, if I think it's interesting, I might tell you about it anyway, but I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not going to say I believe it. I'm just going to put it out there. And he keeps to that fairly consistently. Most of it is chronological. We find out assignments of people in here, names, all sorts of stuff, including religious things in Arrian that we don't find in the other sources. They're just not there. He is the detail king of the Alexander sources. It doesn't mean he's always reliable. He has reasons for choosing Aristobulus and Ptolemy. But to us, we would find the Ptolemy choice funny. He says, I trust him because he's a king, and it would be more unkingly for him to lie than the average person. I think, especially in our modern cynical day of politicians, that tends to make us, at best, laugh, at most, kind of roll our eyes. But he is at least using some critical facilities. Arrian, as I said, he wanted to be Homer, but the other person he really modeled himself on was Xenophon. Even the name in Greek of his history is the Anabasis of Alexander, which he takes from Xenophon's Anabasis, or the march up country that occurred after the death of Cyrus the Younger, one of our big important Greek histories prior to Alexander history. So he's very proud of that. So the Anabasis is his big thing. He also has the story on the Indus where he uses Nearchus as his primary source. Nearchus, of course, is Alexander's admiral. There is an after Alexander, which is extremely fragmented. We only have a few little things. Oh, I wish we had that, but we don't. And again, Arrian's part of this second sophistic. Even though he's not necessarily a philosopher of it, he's very much influenced by, I actually don't like the word impacted. It sounds too hip. He's very much influenced by that idea of the second sophistic. As I said, he wants to be Homer. In the second introduction, which is when Alexander lands at Troy, he steps back and he has this long secondary excursus on what he's doing. And he says, Alexander didn't get a Homer, so I'm going to be Homer. I'm going to go through and I'm going to decide what is the best things, and I'm going to filter this and tell you what's good. So he's setting himself up as the historian here. But again, the very sources he's using, like Ptolemy, are suspect when it comes to Perdiccas, because Ptolemy and Perdiccas kind of came at it. Ptolemy's writing his history many years later. He would dearly love to kind of downgrade Perdiccas's memory, and he doesn't come off well in Arrian. So you have to be aware of things like that. Arrian is not the good historian compared to Curtius or Diodorus or others. So he has his own pitfalls. So you must keep those in mind. There are, again, some lacunae, some missing sections in Arrian, not as many as we have in Curtius. So we do have Alexander's. Arrian's one of our few sources that tells us about Alexander's first 2 years before he crossed into Asia. That's in Arrian. And again, a list of jobs and such that people had that are missing in other places are found in Arrian. So very important text, and again, our longest history of Alexander. That then brings me to the last of the bunch, Justin. Justin is our second Latin author. And Justin is also writing a long history. He goes into the Hellenistic period, so in that way, he's more like Diodorus. He's not a single theme author. He is much shorter. What is an epitome? It is kind of a Reader's Digest version of Pompeius Trogus. Justin, maybe the very earliest date we could give Justin is 144, 145. So the middle of the 2nd century CE. He may be even later. I don't think he's way late. I think that's probably, I would say late 2nd century, very early 3rd century would fit Justin. Who is Pompeius Trogus? He was a Gallic Roman, and we can probably end, that is, the time after which he was not writing, is about 20 CE. So time-wise, okay, he and Diodorus are contemporaries. Okay, he's maybe a little later than Diodorus is. But that is not Justin. Okay. Justin, even though this is an epitome, it is not cut and paste. Justin has his own themes. Justin's very interested in dynasties, the rise and fall of dynasties, and what contributes to it, including those god-awful dynastic queen mothers who are necessary because they birth the next generation, but they're so terrible. And so you have to be very careful. Justin's extremely hostile overall to Philip, to Alexander. And some of what he tells about in the successor kingdoms just make you go, what? And it's the same thing with earlier periods as well. Just like Plutarch, Justin lies. He changes facts as they suit him for this larger narrative that he is interested in. We don't know if some of those errors are introduced by Justin himself, or if they were in Pompeius Trogus, who is also not a positive history. That's harder to say, but you just have to be so very careful about the details in Justin. And if they're not corroborated by another source and they smell fishy, they probably are fishy. It's so unfortunate because there are things in Justin that simply aren't found in any of our other sources. So he has material, for instance, on Philip's time up in Thrace that is not even in Diodorus. So we don't know if it's true or not. But for instance, just to give you an example, in Justin, Philip's last wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, has a baby just before he dies, and it's a boy. Okay, Kyranos. Alexander kills Kyranos. Has his baby brother killed. In all our other sources, it's a girl, Europa. Justin changed it. Sometimes historians want to fix it. They want to reconcile Justin with the other sources. And so they invent 2 babies that she had 2. No, there was no time, guys. She had one baby, and it was a girl, and her name was Europa, which also makes sense. He named his daughters for things. So Thessaloniki is victory in Thessaly, Europa is victory in Europe, meaning he's consolidated Europe. Now let's go get Asia. It was a girl, and there was one child. So this is a sort of shifts that Justin makes, sometimes intentional to raise the drama level. So think of him as kind of the Hollywooder, if you will, of some of the Alexander histories. And you have to just be so very, very careful when you're dealing with Justin. He is our shortest history of Alexander. So if Diodorus is compressed, Justin is uber compressed because, again, it's an epitome, and he's trying to rush through things. But he does occasionally talk about things that are not found in other sources. The question is just how far can we trust this? And once more, if he is contradicted by one of the other four, go with one of the other four. Okay, he's probably not right, especially when it comes to details. So those are our big five, and we will continue in another video with our other extant existing ancient sources that do talk about Alexander, but not in any kind of lengthy narrative format.